Hi, I'm Zewing, and today I'm going to be talking about how to aggro in set 2. So with new formats, aggro decks tend to be really strong right out of the gate because they are fundamentally pretty easy to build and really proactive. And control decks often take a little bit of time to be able to develop which answers you need to be playing. And I think with Shadows of the Galaxy, this is no exception, with a lot of the strong decks right at the start of the format from day one have been these really proactive aggro decks. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about like the different flavors of aggro and some of the different decks that have been popular in the meta right now. And then I want to talk about a bunch of just like common play patterns and things you want to consider when you're piloting these aggro decks and cards that you want to be thinking about as you're playing out the matches. So let's get into it. So I think to start us off, the first thing that we wanted to think about is I think aggro decks right now are kind of divided up into two camps. The first camp is all the double yellow Cunning decks, where Cunning is just a super strong card where all the modes, especially the first 3 modes, just get an insane amount of tempo. With pushing this +4, exhausting 2 units, and bouncing things back to the opponent's hand are just all really good, and you get to do 2 of them. And with units on board, this just means that you are just full delaying your opponent's turn and pushing extra damage on your own. So all of the Cunning decks are really strong. In addition, the Energy Conversion Lab decks have gotten 2 really good upgrades with Poe Dameron and Wrecker that are really good cards on their own, right? Where if you're just playing them for 5 or 6 mana on their own, they have Wrecker as a really strong when-played ability, and Poe Dameron, if he gets to attack, is really good. But then combined with Ambush, this is often enough to kind of just close out the game by itself, where you're able to just get a huge advantage off of ambushing them off of Energy Conversion Lab and getting their like on attack or when played +7 or 6 damage immediately. And that is really good and often just gets you a board position that makes it really easy to close the game after that. So I think when we're thinking about how to build aggro right now, these are like kind of the 2 things that you want to be tending towards, where they are just so fundamentally strong that you really want to be kind of building decks around them if you can. So I'm going to get into a couple decks. Let's start with the Cunning decks first. So here we got just classic Boba Yellow. So Boba Yellow with the last set, I think was actually a really strong deck, but with the upgrades that I got from Shadows of the Galaxy, you no longer have to play a bunch of really bad filler cards, which is really nice for the deck. You now just get to play a bunch of just really like premium cards. You get to play additional like 3 mana 3/5s Toro. You could even play DJ instead of that. You get to play this like 4-Lom Zuckuss package that's really nice. You have these really good utility cards with like Boba Fett's Armored Jetpack, New Adventure, that just give you additional angles of attack that you didn't have before. And then you still just get to use all of the really strong Cunning cards, where if like, Cunning itself, Surprise Strikes, Waylays, No Good to Be Deads, on top of like, classic cards, Boba, Cantina Bouncer that we were using last time. So all in all, in addition, I think the final thing that this deck really got was a really good anti-control package, right? We have Bazines, Bodies, TIE Phantoms now that all just give us a really good edge against control, because these are all cards that are really strong when we're playing against control decks. So I think this deck just got a ton of upgrades over Shadows of the Galaxy and has made it itself like really definitely one of the strongest decks just coming out of the gate. In a similar vein, we have this kind of Han Yellow deck that actually just kind of popped up at SCG Baltimore. I think it won like a 1K and a 2K, I believe. And fundamentally, it's doing similar things to Boba Yellow, just in a kind of a different, like, heroism shell, where we have really strong, like, space units, Millennium Falcon, the gunship, we can get that out early. We, of course, have Cunnings and Waylay Surprise Strikes, right? All just really premium interaction and ways to push damage. And then we also have this like DJ tech combo that lets us completely just disrupt the opponent and also get ahead on resources as well. And you'll notice that over both these decks, both of them are in with leaders that are really good at getting a early resource advantage, right? Han Solo is able to just go up on resources against anybody by using cards, and then Boba is able to just get a bunch of untaps with his leader ability as well. So you're able to just deploy threats a lot faster and use your mana a lot more efficiently than other decks, and then you're able to just kind of tempo them out using cards like Cunning and Surprise Strike Waylay with that. So this is another good Cunning option, and probably will get a lot more popular, especially after last weekend. Getting into the other, like the red-green heroism decks now, we have the classic like Sabine ECL deck, where this deck looks really similar to how it looked in set 1, except we just have a way better top end now with Poes and Wreckers, especially, where we play it basically the same way. We're playing just all really premium 2-drops into 3-drops, and then we have like a Sabine 4 with like a K2SO or a Wing Leader or something like that. But then the big difference now is that our turn 5 or turn 4, where we have like an ECL Poe or Wrecker, is just really crazy, where we're able to, if we are still have onboard advantage and we just use one of those with ECL to just keep pushing our advantage, we often can just close up the game really shortly after that. So this deck is just fundamentally really strong, using the Rebel synergies that we know and love as well. And yeah, just got that insane tool of Poe and Wrecker that I was talking about before. The other flavor of this shell is I've seen is this Han Solo deck that's playing Young Han. I think this deck is from the Swoop Racers, I believe, where you're kind of doing something somewhat similar to Sabine, except that you're a lot more efficient at just vomiting your hand on the field. You're playing almost like a zoo style deck from like Magic or Hearthstone, if you are familiar with that, where you just get to play a bunch of like 1-drops and 2-drops and just put out a bunch of power on the board. Really get super good efficient trades because your units are just really strong even if they have damage on them. And then you have this same kind of late game where you are selling the Poes, selling the Wreckers. But on top of that, I think Han can also just play to these late game threats a lot easier too, where you get to play these Wreckers for 5, these Poes for 4 if you want to. Post board, you have these home 1s. You have these IGs where you, at some point, you're just like playing out all these really hard to deal with, like 5 and 6 drops or 8 drops that give this deck not only like a really good early game, but also a really good late game as well. So this is kind of another flavor of this like engine conversion lab with all these premium threats that you probably would want to consider as well. So those are some of the probably popular aggro decks that are prevalent in the meta right now. What I want to do is kind of go over some of the play patterns that I think you want to be considering when you're playing kind of like any of these decks. And I think the things I'm going to go over kind of apply to how you want to approach aggro a lot in this format. So starting us off, the first thing I want to talk about is lane dodging. So one of the things in this game is when you don't have the initiative and your opponent starts off with a 2-drop in like the space or ground arena, one of the things you often want to do, especially if you know you're going to be the aggressor in the matchup, is to try to play to the other arena. So something I've seen people do is, maybe they open with 2-drops, but then they resource one of them, and then their opponent plays like let's say we kept our Sabine Wren and our opponent plays like a Battlefield Marine. Well, now we have to play this Sabine Wren into their Battlefield Marine, and then they're going to be able to just kill our Sabine Wren almost for free right away on their next turn. So that's not a good spot. So we want to often have options when playing 2-drops when we know that they're going to have specific types of statted units that might be able to just kill our units for free in whatever arena, or when we know we're going to be the aggressor in the matchup and we want to just avoid them having the option of trading. Now, on those lines, we also want to consider that even though we are the aggro deck, we don't always want to just be going base every single time. One thing that I've seen a lot with is like kind of novice players is that they get in their head that, oh, I'm playing the aggro deck, I'm always just going to go base, and I'm just going to kind of ignore what the opponent's doing. But I think that's just fundamentally not how these decks work. And even though they are the aggro deck, a lot of times the way that your cards and your units line up, where if you have a really good trade, like for example this, you have this Boba Fett into their Battlefield Marine, and you just have a really good attack, you should just be taking it a lot of the time, because you will be able to just make up for the missed damage on their base by just having a way better board presence, and that is really what causes you to win the games. I think especially now that a lot of the games are going to just be involving kind of snowballing board presence, that this matters even more, where you really don't want to give them opportunities to be able to like use whatever board presence they have in order to snowball against your board. So take the good trades if they are, otherwise just go base, and think about how you want to pressure them. But when you have like, really juicy attacks like this, don't be afraid to just take them, even though you are the like quote unquote aggro deck, right? The other thing I kind of wanted to go over is understanding what like your lethal ranges are in these type of decks. And I think this is something that as you just practice a lot with these aggro decks, you're gonna kind of pick up on. But what you really want to be understanding is when you have certain board states, or when you get into like, I need to top deck specific cards, you really want to be thinking and understanding what cards you specifically are trying to draw in whatever situation you're in, depending on like how much damage they have on base, etc. So thinking about these kind of things, if you think about like a combination, like let's say we have a K2SO on board and we have a heroic sacrifice, we have the initiative, we can just immediately hit them for 9, right? K2 with heroic sacrifice hits for 6, and then when defeated hits for another 3. So that's like a range that your opponent needs to know, and that we also need to know that if we, have K2 and then draw the heroic sacrifice, we can hit them for 9 and then put them into whatever range, right? Similar thing with Rebel Assault. Maybe you can often like push, 8 to 9 damage with this card with one action. And that one action thing is really key, because you'll often get into board states with these aggro decks where it's just like, both you and your opponent have lethal on board, and it's like who can figure out how to lethal the opponent with the least amount of actions possible. This is like where knowing when to specifically take the initiative, because you need to draw into specifically heroic sacrifice or rebel assault, is really important. And understanding those kind of game states where it's like, okay, I have whatever units on board, this specific set of cards gets me out of this situation. If I top deck it now, I need to just take initiative and hope that I draw one of those cards. Similar thing of like chaining for a cause I believe in and stuff like that. That's also like a range that you want to understand, like for a cause I believe in plus like Sabine ping, just like 5 damage potentially out of hand, right? That's something you also want to consider as well, and you want to be playing towards these and keeping them in mind throughout the whole game. Really similarly with the Cunning decks, and I think a lot, especially with like the Cunning decks, is understanding how to punish the opponent's tapping out to be able to push a lot of damage is really important. So something that will come up sometimes is like, if you have a Toro on board, they tap out of all their mana, you might be able to like Cunning, give Toro +4, hit for 7, play a Greedo that's a bounty hunter to untap Toro, hit for another 7, and that's like 14 damage that is they didn't expect at all, just completely because they like tapped out and couldn't interact with it. Similarly, maybe against, this has happened a lot against when I'm playing against control decks or something like that with Boba Yellow, where it's like I will hold like Fet's Fire Spray and New Adventure in hand until they like tap out for something, and then okay, they have no more resources up, they can't kill the Fet's Fire Spray, I'm just gonna hit for 5, New Adventure it, hit for another 5, that's 10 damage right away. And then also like understanding when you put them into surprise strike range is really big with these kind of Cunning decks, where you'll get into a lot of states where it's just like, okay, like, I need to just take the initiative here, because if I draw Cunning right now, I just win, and that's like my only out in this situation or whatever. So understanding these kind of like surprise strike lethal ranges is really big too. So I said I was going to talk about Cunning, and I'm going to talk about it here. This is where I kind of wanted to talk about cards that are really good against aggro, and honestly the first card that comes to mind is Cunning, right? Like, we're playing Cunning in our aggro deck, but this is also like the most important card in the aggro matchup, where it almost feels like the person who draws more Cunnings wins a lot of the time, because this card is just so backbreakingly strong in the aggro matchup and also against aggro, right? So this is one of the things that you really want to consider. It's like, you will get into states where it's like, okay, you have maybe a couple options, and it's like, all right, if I take, do this action, and they play Cunning, how bad is it for me, right? You want to try to make Cunning, and sometimes you can't play around it, and that's okay, right? But you want to consider that they have Cunning and how you can play around this, so it's not just a complete blowout for you. So this is one of the reasons why I think the Cunning decks are probably one of the strongest things to do right now, because if a lot of people are going to be playing these like proactive aggro decks, and Cunning is also good against other decks as well, right? It's not just like good against aggro, it's good against everything because it's so modal. But Cunning makes your matchup against other aggro decks really good, and that's really what I think you want to be doing in the early meta. So playing the Cunning decks is a really good choice right now. Other things that you want to consider when you're playing these aggro decks against other decks is cards like Overwhelming Barrage and Super Laser Blast, like the board wipes. You want to think about, and especially like Barrage more so, but Super Laser Blast, sometimes they ramp into it, and sometimes they are able to actually survive until they blast you. You want to consider how you don't get blown out as much against these cards if you can, where maybe with if you're playing against a deck that has Barrage, and it's pretty clear they're trying to set up for it, maybe you like take a trade instead of like putting some amount of damage base, because if they have Barrage, they just kill my whole board, and it's better that I at least trade something off here, right? Same thing as Super Laser Blast. Try not to overextend into this if you know that this is like basically their only out in a lot of situations. Like, a lot of times it's pretty telegraphed when they are playing towards this, where they will do things or take initiative in spots where it's like, okay, yeah, obviously you have a Super Laser Blast, or you're trying to play towards the Super Laser Blast, so you don't need to just dump your whole hand into this when you have enough things to probably lethal them, on board, right? So think about how to play around the board wipes. Another card you want to consider how to play around is the Client, and this card honestly is not like as big of an aggro killer as I thought it was going to be at the start of the spoiler season. Like, I thought this card was just going to be really strong against aggro, and it is kind of good, but it's a lot more awkward to use than I thought. But it is really good at helping these like villain control decks stabilize against you, where like in the mid game they're often able to get to a state where maybe you're playing like 1-2 units a turn, but then they're able to answer like 1 unit really cleanly, so then the Client lets you heal 5 damage off of that, and that's pretty big. So this card can help them stabilize a lot, but luckily that a lot of the aggro decks that were, all the aggro decks that we're playing right now have like clean answers to this, where, we attack Poe into the Client and he just kills it outright. You remove the shield and then hit it for 6. We can bounce it back with, all the yellow decks, right? We can Waylay, continue to bounce or Cunning it. So Client's probably way worse against the yellow decks than it is against the ECL decks, but this is something that you kind of want to consider, and kind of how to play around a little bit once we get into like the mid game and they're trying to stabilize with it. It's like, understand like the play pattern of this and how much the life they're going to be able to gain, and if it's worth trying to answer it if you can. The last thing I want to talk about, and this is kind of like a relic from the set 1 decks, and this is still pretty popular in a lot of decks now, is this like ECL Star Viper thing. This is probably most relevant into Sabine, if anything, because Sabine is still playing like the A-Wings and the Red 3s, and this energy conversion with Star Viper is really good into the start of like A-Wing Red 3, and Star Viper just completely answers that. Now, so that's something that if you're playing against somebody who has this like Star Viper package, that's something that you want to maybe you're not gonna go that A-Wing into Red 3, right? You want to consider that okay, they have, an easy way to answer that that's really backbreaking for me. Maybe I'll go more ground heavy in that case, right? So that's something you want to consider. And this isn't like all the cards you want to be playing around. This is just some key things that I wanted to pick out. But yeah, I think you really want to understand how to play against like other decks as aggro, because there are very specific cards that matter, and you need to understand like what you're doing against them in order to succeed. So yeah, that's all the main stuff that I wanted to get into with this video. Be sure to subscribe. I'm going to be putting out a lot more content with Set 2 Shadows of the Galaxy, going over a bunch of decks, and I think especially as we go into Gen Con, there's going to be a lot more things that are maybe discovered or new decks to talk about. So yeah, be sure to subscribe for more of that. Thanks.